All right, welcome back to another episode of the Crystal Cocoon. Today, let's see. We've got Brandon Lapierre of Seeds of the Divine, and Hannaneel Perez, and Jesse Dujari with Healing Pathwalkers. And today we're going to talk about the multiverse, parallel realities, and past lifetimes. We also had a question of the week that we thought we'd go ahead and start with. This one's from Peggy Wallman in Salem, Oregon, and she asked me, how can energy work help the grieving process? I thought that was a great question that each of us would probably have our own perspective on. Do you want to share yours, Hannah?
Well, I think grief is one of those really interesting emotional experiences that just about everyone on the planet has experienced in some point or another. It's not something we talk about very often because grief is usually associated with death, which in a lot of societies and cultures is a really taboo subject. So I found that in my personal experience, as far as energy work and grief, one thing has been to allow the process to happen. When I was actually helping somebody through the suicide of her brother, the energy work that we did at that point was related to hyena medicine. I had a hyena totem come to me, and hyena taught me that the only grief or the only cure for grief that hyena knew of was laughter. Oh. So it's important.
Laughter.
Yeah. Hyenas are really good at creating that kind of that energy. They're very family oriented. They don't have gender. I mean, they obviously do. They have male and female, but the male and female look very much the same presenting wise.
The females have a prehensile genitalia, yeah.
Yes.
So theirs is bigger than the boys, I think.
So the balancing of masculine and feminine energy is particularly in grief, because a lot of times women get stuck a lot and men don't express. So we get polarities in people being stuck in grief in different aspects of it. There was a really phenomenal psychiatrist, Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, who did a lot of early studies on death and dying. And she is the one who put together the 5 stages of grief. So understanding what those stages are, that it's okay to be angry, it's okay to be sad, it's okay to feel betrayed. All of those energies are all part of the grieving process. So allowing yourself that process has been really important. And then energetic support for that. Physically supporting yourself, a lot of self-care, a lot of just, people holding space for you. I mentioned in an earlier podcast that I'd had a friend who passed away about 6 weeks ago. Right. And I actually just got a message from his wife today that she's still really struggling. And, it's been 6 weeks and she's having a hard time processing life without him and really getting through that and just reaching out to people to hold space for her. We put together a box of love memories where we put all of these wonderful memories that all of us had of Stan and of her husband and of her and of their family so that she could go to that box anytime she needed. So she could get that little boost of love and comfort, compassion, mercy, all of those wonderful things. So that's been kind of my experience in working energetically, creating a lot of space for people to just be.
Yeah, definitely. How about you, Brandon?
Well, I think the grieving process itself, there's reasons for people having the grieving process, and usually it's that people try to shove down these emotions. They try not to feel the grief because it's sad and it doesn't feel good sometimes. But it feels worse when you shove it down. So part of the energy work helping the grieving process is to really bring it up in the forefront. And the other aspect to that too is that when you get certain types of energy work, it changes the quantum field around the person and they actually feel closer to the person that passed. Yeah. So this feeling of loss and disconnection, it's lessened because they can feel the person oftentimes, and they get this sense of peace within themselves, peace of the passing process, peace of the transformation process, and peace within themselves for allowing them to have this whatever emotions come up along with the grief, and just to really express it and feel it and be okay with it. It doesn't mean that the grief or the sadness and missing the person won't come back up, but it does mean usually that it won't be as traumatic when they allow it. And that's part of what energy work helps with. I've worked with people who are also in grieving process, and during the energy work, opening up that field, she was actually able to feel her mom and talk to her mom. And I saw her when I was doing the energy work, close her hands around like another hand, and she was actually saying that she could feel her hand in hers while she was talking to her. I didn't hear the conversation, but I felt someone come into the room. So there's that aspect that can really be helpful with energy work as well. Of course, not everybody has that. You have to really be open to that experience, and it helps when you've already done work along the way to get your channels open. But for most people, it really is about allowing that emotional experience to be worked through.
Yeah. For myself, I personally, I haven't lost a lot of people in my life. I've been really quite fortunate to not have had to deal with that, had to deal with death too much. I lost my grandparents, but, they were older and they had a good life. And I've always kind of been of the belief that we don't die, we just transition anyway. So it wasn't a big deal to me, though I miss my grandmother. And when I started training actually as an energy worker, my best friend's sister was murdered. And their family was still recovering from the death of their father, from a early death, really. He was quite young when he passed. So it was a lot of grief, and it was a big family. And I learned a lot working with that family. And it is, you're right, about holding space, Hannaneel. So much about holding space for them to be upset. But also it is about, Brandon, I think, connecting them with the energies and helping them to see the loss isn't actually so great. And my friend actually was able to feel both her father and her sister and communicate with them. And so for her, the transition was different than the rest of the family, who felt really disconnected, like that true sense of loss. The reason the question came up was in a group we were talking in, I mentioned my own healing process for my own childhood wounds and how that required me to grieve for the loss of that little girl's experience, that she didn't get the childhood that she deserved, that she really should have had, of being safety, having stability, having support, not being abused. So I think the other piece of it is that we forget that we all have something to grieve, that we're grieving for, and when we can connect into what that is for ourselves, for what we've lost along this journey, because most of us who work as healers or energy workers, we walk the hard road. We have a lot coming our way, and we tend to push away how that feels to us by focusing on helping other people, by focusing on making ourselves available to other people, working with other people through their problems, but we don't turn that back on ourselves very often. And so that was how the discussion came up, was, how I've used energy work to support my own grieving process for myself, for who I could have been. Yeah.
I think that's an excellent point. I think there's another, just to kind of expound upon that, is that grief comes for a variety of reasons.
Right.
I mean, if you get in a car accident and the car that you love is now gone, it's okay to grieve for your car.
Right.
When we experience loss of any kind, that is usually where grief steps in. And sometimes, especially in a lot of, cultures, we've been told to just, walk it off, shake it off.
Buck up.
Yeah. You're fine. Everything's fine. Well, logically and mentally, yeah, it does make sense to just kind of move on. But emotionally, sometimes there are things that you need to work through, and giving yourself the space to do that is really, really important. And sometimes I know from my own process, I lost a child really young, and I was really young too. So I was 21, 22, and I wasn't prepared. I had no idea how to deal with that kind of loss that early in my own life. And you're right. It's definitely one thing when we lose a grandparent who might be 60, 70 plus years old and they've lived a wonderful life. But it's quite another when you lose a child that never really got a chance to live in the first place. So it took me into my 30s to really process a lot of that and allow myself the space to actually grieve, because there were so many people in my life who were like, oh, well, you'll have more kids. okay, well, that doesn't really help. I didn't want more kids. I wanted that kid. So, and being able to talk about a lot of taboo, like death subjects, I think is really helpful for grief. Because a lot of people have experienced it, but they don't talk about it.
Right. Well, and, that's the mention of a car accident. That brings up my stepsister. She just recently had to have her leg amputated, as a result of an accident that she'd had a few years back. And after years and years and I don't even know how many dozens of surgeries and so much pain. And it was interesting. I love and respect her for doing this because she has documented her whole journey on Facebook, by posting kind of what she's gone through and what her challenges are. And it's been beautiful to watch. But she participated in this interesting program where they wanted to avoid the phantom limb problem, by instituting the grieving process before it even happened. So they had her, starting to do visualizations about not having the limb. They also started doing a pain blocker for the limb a few months before the surgery even occurred, so that she already was relaxed and wasn't feeling the limb before it was removed. So it was really fascinating to watch that and her process of recovery, because she never hid away from that grief. She really confronted it head on and was open about it and allowed people to support her. She's now, she's just a few weeks out from it and she's doing really well. She's out there doing yoga in the field with her prosthetic cast, and it's been an inspiration and that's right. Because we hold back from feeling emotion so much. We want so badly to feel good all the time, especially in our culture where we no longer have any impulse control. We want everything to just work and feel good and be happy and everyone to get along and it all to be so positive. But the reality is there's a gamut of experiences and emotions. And that suffering is just as valid of a part of that experience as the joy is. So stop trying to hide away from it and just be sad sometimes, and that's what I work with my clients on. It's okay to be upset. You're supposed to be angry right now. This is a frustrating, upsetting, hard experience. Don't judge yourself for how you're feeling. Just let yourself feel it. And I think that's my best advice for grief, really, is letting yourself feel it, experience it, and create space for yourself as well. Well, that kind of wraps up our question. We have some special thank yous, some special mentions. We want to just thank all of our listeners because we have people all around the globe now listening to us. We've got about 150 of you guys that are coming and listening to most everything that we've put up. So really, thank you guys. And you guys are starting to reach out and contact us. We love hearing from you. Feel free to join the conversation on the Facebook group of the Crystal Cocoon, or just check out our page and you can see what's going on with us. We always post episodes and we have some other writers contributing. It's really quite cool, actually. So this week we were going to talk about the multiverse, this concept of the multiverse and dimensions. And we talk about this a lot, really, in our conversations because there's so many ways you can use these concepts in energy work. Brandon introduced me to Robert Gould, right? Is that his name? No. What's his name? The guy who does he gave me this CD set. I'll look up his name.
Burt Goldman.
Burt Goldman, yes. Burt Goldman, thank you. Mm-hmm. Who teaches about, accessing representations of yourself in other universes and in other expressions of reality and how you can work on yourself that way, which I found fascinating. But Brandon talks the most about all of this, so I'm going to let him start.
Well, yeah, I have that astral body experience where I met myself in another version of reality.
Please tell that.
And had an interaction. I think, did we already talk about that on another show?
Oh, we might have. Yes, we did actually. Yeah, that's right. So that's a great That's a great, lead into this.
Okay, so talking about the meeting myself, and then like Burt Goldman using that concept within his work to access another versions intently. There's just a couple examples of why it's important, because the more you understand about the way reality works, the less hold your perception of reality has over you. So one really good video I found was on YouTube called Imagining the 10th Dimension. and it goes into a visual breakdown of what each dimension is, and actually correlates to a lot of intuitive information from other healers and energy workers and visionaries like Teal Swan. She started giving a breakdown of what these dimensional realities look like, and how each one acts and you interact with each one. So on that video, one of the things he says is the initial conditions will create different universes. So the initial conditions being like the first dimension and the first three. And the first three react according to how gravity works and stuff like that. So the first dimension being basically a straight line. It's length only. There's no width. The second being length and width. And the third, of course, is what we're all familiar with, length, width, height. Or depth. But the interesting thing is when he started getting into the higher dimensions, something that most people don't really think about, the fourth dimension being time, or he put it in duration. Mm-hmm. So duration itself, I think it's important to note that it's duration, not necessarily like a forward movement in time like we think about, mm-hmm. because it can go back and forth. And when you get into the higher dimensions, it kind of proves that concept that time doesn't really exist. And it goes more into it, basically, how the dimensions interact with each other. Time is a perception of existence, not necessarily a fact of reality in a linear forward-moving manner. What he says is the duration, basically, you move through the fourth dimension one quantum frame at a time. And we only see this as a cross-section of our fourth dimensional self. And we're instantly jumping from one third dimensional frame to another because of the way it wraps back onto itself, one 3D aspect, and it wraps up back onto another 3D aspect of itself. And this correlates to what Bashar says in his teachings, where he says we're moving through one frame at a time, and each instant or each frame is actually another parallel reality. And that's a really important concept to think about too, because each node in time branches off into an infinite nature or infinite possibilities that you can go into at any one given time. And each new instant, each new node in that period or duration causes a branch off to another new instant in time that have another set of possibilities. And so that explanation right there is basically a little jumping ahead as what they broke down into the higher dimensions and how these things work. Because the sixth or the fifth dimension is the parallel outcomes. So parallel outcomes reside in a space orthogonal or cross-section to space-time. So many worlds reside in the fifth dimension, all intersecting across space-time. And it's where these wrap back onto each other that the fifth dimension exists. And then the sixth dimension is what they call a phase space, where all possible outcomes exist simultaneously. So you think of that as a higher dimensional reality and what a universal consciousness would look like. It's looking at itself from all vantage points at the same time. So when you think about this from a soul's perspective, it's really important to note that you can have past or future lives simultaneously existing at the same time. And this sixth dimensional space is what really makes it possible. It's one of the aspects that makes it possible. But the seventh dimension, it treats the sixth dimensional phase space as a single point. So just like you move from the third dimension to the fourth dimension, it wraps back onto itself. And this is where I mentioned before the mathematics of infinity get involved, mm-hmm. because this is also where that occurs when you have multiple instances of the universes existing and then wrapping back on itself. And this is where you get the multiverse theory. So the multiverse exists within seventh dimensional framework. And then, what's that?
Oh, I was just going to say I was listening to a science conference and they call that the daughter universe theory.
The daughter universe.
I thought that was interesting.
That is interesting. So the 8th dimension is where you get orthogonal lines, just like before, to get every possible physical universe in existence. And then the spatial dimension of the 9th dimension is where all possible universes, even impossible universes, exist only in theory. So this is where more astral planes that can't be physical reality based on the physics of that reality exist, or any reality. So impossible universes that exist only in energy aspects. And then when he talks about the 10th dimension, that's where the omniverse exists, where all points of thought converge into a singularity, which really is everywhere all at once, through all possible realities, through all existence. Basically, God. That's the 10th dimension. So I thought that was really interesting because it breaks down exactly how we can look at and think about our soul family, how we can think about parallel lives, and how those all manifest simultaneously. Talking about the other dimension where you exist past and present and future simultaneously. So this is why souls incarnate in themes. So you actually have theme work that you come to learn, and you'll have different versions of yourself through different timelines. And you can also have different versions of incarnations in even different universes simultaneously, going through that theme work in a different manner.
Yeah, it's fascinating. How about you, Hannaneel?
I'd kind of always heard things from Brian Greens, who's a physicist theorist, and he kind of he's got interesting names. I think he only has 9.
He's a string theorist.
And he, I think, has 9 universes that he has, interesting names for them, like quilted, inflationary, cyclical, landscape, all that kind of interesting stuff, which for me is a easier way to remember things because I remember things better in metaphor. So giving something a name instead of like, dimension 6, I'm like, I don't know what that is. But being able to like, oh, okay. Having a picture in my head about my experience in that level, and then kind of what it feels like. What I find that some people innately have the ability to look at the quantum universe and be able to just calculate a lot of options. There are some people I've met who just have that innate ability to look at the quantum universe, and often when they're doing it, I can feel them like opening the quantum universe, and I'm like, whoa, what's that? I can feel everything all at once. And I'm like, wow, I can feel all of you, the many versions of you. So that's always interesting when somebody has that ability and can look into the quantum universe. It's not something I'm especially practiced at. I'm still practicing that, being able to look and not get absorbed. It's really beautiful.
It's really easy to get lost there.
It is.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's part of why not everyone has the ability. I think that I know for myself, when it came on, I got really confused for a while. I was like reacting to people, and it was this totally other them I was really reacting to, and then I'd come back and I'd be like, I'd still hold that interaction that I'd had over there. And it was very confusing, very confusing. So, yeah.
I think confusion's a huge part of it, because I think there are a lot of fears that we've built into being, holding on to our belief systems. There are so many things that we consider certain.
And identities are identities.
Right. Those are certain identities, right? It's certain. I am so certain that this is going, that's a plausibility. It's a probability. And when you start looking at the world in that regard, that there are no certainties.
And all possibilities are possible.
Right. All possibilities exist. It does kind of open the door, but then there is a lot of that fear and confusion, because if I'm not certain of anything, then what am I certain of? What can I be certain of?
Yeah.
That you are.
Exactly.
That's it.
That's it.
I
Isn't that what-
I am.
I am. I think, therefore, I am.
Right. It gets really, really, really simple. You know, we kind of clog our lives with a lot of layers of beliefs and expectations and stuff like that. And so I think it's really important to talk about this kind of thing so that we can break down those barriers and really enjoy all that's out there. There's so much available to us.
Yeah.
That's the really awesome thing, I think.
I like that you mentioned Brian Greene. I was actually in kind of one of the things that I watched in preparation for this was a science festival from 2013, World Science Festival, where he and some other string theorists and physicists get together and they discuss the multiverse. We'll go ahead and make sure we post that on our in our group discussion page when we post the episode. But it was interesting, you know, how they were describing the universes, the dimensions, and how they all kind of work together. And there was one thing that I thought was really fascinating, and forgive me, I don't know the full name of this scientist, but he took his name was Klotsta or something like that. He said it really fast, and he took Einstein's theory of thought and was, you know, trying to understand the four dimensions. And when he went through it mathematically, he came up with the same equation that another theorist had come up with, Maxwell, a mathematician, of the mathematical equation to represent electromagnetic force. So it was like he was so excited because here he's coming up independently with the same thing to describe. And Brandon, you had said how the fourth dimension, to not think of it necessarily in terms of time, but duration. And that's kind of what he was describing, but in terms of force, you know, this force, which could be duration as well. And they were discussing that. I thought that was really fascinating.
He was talking about time as a force?
Well, he was talking about that the fourth dimension is actually the electromagnetic force that propels or gives energy to what's happening. That drives the action of the universe, of the expression,
expansion and contraction
exactly.
of the universe. The cyclical nature. There's a force that moves.
Right. The force that's moving at a subatomic level, that's moving the particles that are organized at a frequency.
Interesting.
So I thought that was really fascinating too, like hearing, you know, because we can, for me, when I was trying to figure out, well, what am I planning on bringing to this conversation? I don't have as much science background, so I wanted to understand the science aspect of it more. I have a lot of, traveling background in my, my energetic self, but that's, that's all my experience. I'd like to understand what that meant. So I listened to a lot of lectures and discussions about it. And it's interesting how the different perspective of when you look at it from the science versus from the metaphysical realm, how that works. And I've talked with some psychics and they'll start talking about, oh, I'm in the 26th dimension. And I'm like, whoa, really? What is that like? I can't even fathom that. And Brian Greene was saying that you can't really have more than 11 dimensions because once you get beyond the 11th dimension, you can. They'll express up to a certain point in this kind of inflationary like way, and then they'll all collapse back down into 11th dimension. That's really where the last stable dimension exists. So I'm like, well, I want to go explore that because I don't really think when I'm exploring, I'm in the 6th dimension or I'm in the 7th dimension. I'm just like, oh, wow, look at the bubbles. Wow, if I go into that one, whoa. That's how I work. Or, look at the strands.
I think you got to also be careful about when you're psychically determining a number of a dimension, because that's also a perception
right.
of your experience. And it might be important for you to label that and categorize that in your experience so that you can have a reference point to go back to, this is the 22nd or whatever.
Right.
You can just as easily give it some wacky-ass name that you just come up with, really. But
the mermaid dimension.
Let's do that.
I like where you're going with this, Brandon.
I've heard other explanations of reality breakdown as far as dimensionality and how they talk about it more of like a density.
Yes.
And so Bashar talks about like what really people are really talking about when they're ascending through the dimensions is not so much of a dimensional aspect as a density aspect. So that's the other thing that I think people get really confused at. We're ascending to the 5D. Well, if you look at like just the stuff we're just talking about,
right.
whether it be Brian Greene or the other guy from the 10th Dimension YouTube channel, that's spatial dimensions. And the density is more of a person's resonance and their frequency, whatever they're residing at. So the other aspect I was going to get into that goes along with what you're saying is that there is an infinite number of dimensional realities, but they're more of a horizontal plane that goes to infinity than they are vertical aspect that when you're thinking about climbing the dimensions.
Well, it was interesting. That was one of the things in another link I was researching. They were talking about the infinite universe, and that the infinite universe, the theory behind it is that light, continues to spread out infinitely from the Big Bang, and it's on a plane. We see that as on a plane of existence, a flat plane, and so as that one is expressing itself, there are infinite others that are doing the same thing.
Exactly.
And all on this big flat plane. And then they also talk about and how that flat plane eventually must loop back, like you were referencing. I think that was the 6th where it loops back, the infinitely looping. I can't remember. But then they were saying...
that's a phase space, yeah.
Then they were talking about the parallel universe theory. And that, so in that, there's the Big Bang expansion, and it's like a skin. What's his name? Michio Kaku, the physicist, he talks a lot about that in referring to it as a skin. And they said they call it a membrane, and for short they call it a brain. And he said, and for parallel worlds, that's a P, so we call them P brains. And I loved his talk about it, but he basically said how there's skin upon skin in that bang, and we are just experiencing the flat plane in which we are existing in this level of the parallel. So that was also really fascinating.
And when you think about it as a circular phase space that loops back on itself, but then also simultaneously goes to infinity, it actually makes sense when you think about the bubble universe aspect of it.
Exactly. And he said then there's all these other bubbles, which is what we experience when we look as these like a sea foam of bubbles.
Yeah. I was waking up one morning and... epically, I heard Morgan Freeman's voice.
Oh, I love that. He sounds so much like God.
Yeah, I know. He was talking to me. I don't remember exact words. It was really awesome. I think I have it somewhere on Facebook. But so I was waking up, and that's what they were showing me is all these bubbles like stuck together, like the sea foam of bubbles. And these were the different universes. And some of them are so far apart that you really can't get from one to the next.
Right.
But the ones that are kind of close to each other, you can. It's like you have to snake back around them.
Right.
And that's one of the ways he was describing time itself as not being a straight line, but this snaking back and forth and this wiggling action going through these quantum frames, and it creates all these possibilities. So it's never a straight line, but that's how we move through the parallel universes.
So then there was some talk about the daughter universe theory, which I mentioned earlier, and that's the concept of it. Every choice that you make, you create a whole other strand or a whole other experience, and so there's infinite other universes that are being birthed all the time because of all the choices that we make and what we do and we do not do and what we choose not to see. They're all still happening at once. So that's kind of the concept with. Oh, God, I forgot his name already again. Gould? But, the parallel universe guy. And the one we mentioned, Bert Goldman, yeah. That was kind of what he was talking about is that, find one of those others that's made the choices already, that's already accomplished the work that you're looking to do, that maybe got there faster. Look for that one and then bring that vibration back into this life.
I think it kind of helps to think about it, and I was thinking about this the other day because we tend to call like the parallel realities as other universes, but then there's actually other universes where the physics themselves are different.
Yeah.
I personally kind of like to think about it they're related, but like to think about it as like the parallel realities being separate from a parallel universe.
Right.
Where a parallel universe is one of those that like has drastically different physics, drastically different aspects of gravity, whatever rules there are in that existence can be drastically different.
Well, that's what they were talking about with mathematical universes. Mm-hmm. So they were saying, so all the laws that mathematics is simply the language with which we use to describe what's going on around us, to create a way of creating a formula, to get to what's being expressed. And so he said that in other universes, there would be other mathematical laws. Mm-hmm. So then all the rules would change. Gravity may not affect the things in the same way. Right now, we're used to the flat plane of space, and gravity, like the whole concept of the tarp and the weight, making the dips in gravity, creating the force that drives the orbiting of all things, our planets and stars, and blah, blah, blah. So it's interesting when you start thinking in these terms, like how do you really organize all of that information? Because could it all be true? Could it all?
It could.
Yeah, exactly.
All possibilities exist. Exactly. Did you guys ever see the movie Interstellar?
Yeah.
I haven't seen that one. No.
It's a great movie. I really, really enjoyed it because it not only talks about time as being relative to, how we experience Earth time, but planetary times like, a day or an hour on another planet is a year on Earth. So when you're on that planet, you are working within that time frame, although time is existing elsewhere in a much faster way. So they're having to... It's just a really interesting way of looking at it. There's also a part where they're obviously trying to get off the Earth and save humanity. And so they're looking for a way out. And there's a weird sort of phenomena that happens that is a part of, I think, the quantum universe. And there's a part that they show kind of towards the end that sort of, I think in a visual way is a really interesting way of looking at the quantum universe. It looks a bit like a library, and they kind of go through the books, and there's different timelines and different interactions. But I found that movie to be incredibly fascinating as far as giving a sort of explanation to kind of sometimes how I perceive things. Same with the show Doctor Who.
Right.
I do really enjoy that show because it does cover a lot of time theory. I mean, he's a time lord. And so his understanding of how time works and going to the end of the universe and what does that look like. And I think it's just really interesting to play with some of those plausibilities because they are plausibilities. Yeah. So I enjoy seeing creative expression of something that could really be true. So
yeah, that reminds me of Dan Simmons wrote a series of books called Hyperion. The first one was Hyperion. Did you guys read that by any chance?
I haven't, but I've heard of them.
I love Dan Simmons. He's one of my favorite sci-fi authors. He does a lot of hard science, but also out there sci-fi, hard science sci-fi. And he talks about a little bit about that, where it's linking all these different dimensions and planets, and there's, different ways of traveling between them and ports, and how, there's, the story is very all encompassing because it's happening all over the place. It was a great book series, a pilgrimage of people.
Something you said earlier that I thought was interesting, because I've thought about this before.
Just one thing?
Just the one.
Just the one.
Well, you said the light expands infinitely in our universe, right. And it's continuously expanding. And I just wanted to note the as above, so below.
Right.
Because it's the consciousness of the creator aspect. It's God consciousness looking at itself that expands that light infinitely. And when you think about modern physics experiments where they take the double particle slit experiment and the lack of observation on the middle slit causes no diffraction pattern whatsoever.
Right.
You have to observe it to make it so. And so the outside slit of that experiment shows the diffraction pattern because that's where they're observed. Now, physically, it seems like that would be an impossible feat, but what it's really showing is it's this conscious observation that makes reality what it is. And the light expanding infinitely is exactly the same principle. It's the creation itself, observing itself. And then that's part of what we're all doing here.
Einstein actually talked about how when you start looking at the expressions of the universe and dimensions, they're really like strings of energy. There's a string of frequency that is the consciousness, and it is a collection of these frequencies. And so he said that if you could hear that, if you knew God, what you would do is hear music, because it's the sound of all the frequencies playing together to be in with God. And I thought that was really beautiful.
I did another interview for another podcast that I was doing with somebody named Dale Pond. And Dale Pond is he's a pattern observer. He's a pattern researcher. And one of the things he observed is everything in the universe goes through patterns. There's an overall harmonic that goes within the universe. And then with that, there's many subharmonics, but they all make a characteristic sine wave. And it's the combination of these sine waves that make the music of the universe.
Yeah.
That makes total sense.
Yeah.
It really does.
If you take out the third dimension of looking at even a helix structure, it's essentially a repetition of sine waves. You know.
Well, I think, as I was saying earlier about people who are able to look at the quantum universe, typically those people are often able to discern patterns much more easily. So when you're looking in the quantum universe, you're looking for the pattern. You're looking for the things that are seemingly inconsequential but are linking one event to the next, to the next, to the next, in a really divine way. Yeah,
and that's really the birth of string theory, is they were trying to understand, they're looking at the patterns that physicists were coming up with, and they're like, something is missing. We're missing something. One of them was, they had a great graphic in one of the posts that I'll put up, one of the science fair, and it was, showing if you were a one-dimensional being and you lived in this straight line, and if a four-dimensional or even a three-dimensional, a cube-like being came through that straight line, what you would experience is first suddenly a triangle formed, or that was if you were two-dimensional. If you were one-dimensional, you would just see that suddenly the line is being impacted by a narrow bit, and then a wider bit, and then a much wider bit, and then a much narrower bit, and then nothing. What was that? What passed through us? We would have no concept. So if you're in a two-dimensional reality and this cube passes through, let's say it's skewed and it's passing through one corner first you're experiencing a triangle. Oh my God, this triangle. Oh my God, now it's a square. There's a square here. Oh my God, and now it's a triangle again. And now it's gone. What was that? Where did it go? But we wouldn't be able to conceive that there's some other object. And so they were saying that was kind of the approach that they took in trying to see the whole that was missing in the physicists' understanding of dimensionality. And I thought that was a fascinating way of looking.
And that's really a beautiful concept to think about when you think about our movement through the whole universe itself, the whole galactic orbit, and how we're moving through these frequencies that many people can kind of feel, but they don't understand. They're like, what was that? Oh, that was a shitty day, or that was rough. All these different healers are talking about moving through these energies and the supermoon being really intense and so forth, but they can't tangibly tell you what exactly it is a lot of times.
Right.
So I think that's a very similar concept of how we're moving through and experiencing these other aspects of energies and dimensionality as we're in this time of change.
They also talked about, so we think of, when we're thinking of dimensionality, we tend to be going out, looking bigger.
Yeah.
But he was saying, we have to also, there's the converse, there's the going in, the dimensionality as well. So he said, let's say you look up and you see this power line up there, and right where the power pole connects, you see straight lines going into this pole-like thing. But when you get up close and you look at it up close, you can see that there's this cable isn't a straight line at all. It's actually circular. And there's these ants traveling around the cable, and they have, to them, this is their universe. This is their reality. It's a circular reality that they can travel around and along on, and that's a whole different expression. And so it's just one way of kind of taking what we know and using it to visualize something that we can't quite conceptualize, just because we do have all of those dimensions. We do exist in the fourth dimension. We do have time affecting us, or force rather, whatever you want to call that. And we are able to see these and understand these concepts. So moving into the fifth dimension, another video I'd watched a while back was saying, what does it mean that we're moving into the fifth dimension? What does that mean to be going 5D? Well, just like how...
Density.
Exactly. Yeah. Just like how we look at the world around us, and we can easily distinguish what 3D is right now. And it's not hard to think of that. It's going to be the same to look back on the 4D. And suddenly, just like now we can manipulate and take a 2-dimensional object in our 3-dimensional reality and turn it into a 3-dimensional object like origami with a flat piece of paper, we'll be able to do the same thing with time from the 5th dimension because we're looking back on it. So I thought that was a nice way of putting it. Mm-hmm. And that also brings to mind the density comment. We talked about this a while back, Corey Goad, the interview with Corey Goad, right. And he brings up the blue avians who exist at a different density.
Yeah.
And they were talking about that's really what's going on is the density is changing for us, and we're shifting into a less dense or higher frequency, able to hold a higher resonance of frequency. So I think that's fascinating too.
Which is probably part of the reason why people are seeing more having more UFO sightings.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
As we change into a different density, you're able to perceive more yourself. People are having more psychic awarenesses and psychic openings. Like most of the healers I talk to, it's like, oh, I'm able to perceive more like I did before. Mm-hmm. And many people are growing at a rapid rate. Uh-huh. And it's because of that shift in density that makes that possible. Just like there's certain times of the day where remote viewers are more accurate because of that electromagnetic spectrum being shifted. Our overall density is being shifted, and that's why we're also more effective as a whole, and people are waking up more.
Yeah, I actually just saw it was a really shortened clip by Bashar. It was one of those really interesting moments where he's channeling, and then suddenly somebody else comes through, and he has to kind of stop and channel whoever else
I've never seen that.
Oh, it was really beautiful.
Please send that to me.
Yeah, no, I will definitely post it later because it definitely had a really serious resonance for me. Because he was talking about this just recent blood moon, supermoon that had happened, and how the interstitial dimensions are shifting dramatically, and that literally time is coming apart at the seams, and that soul contracts are being rewritten. There's a lot of things being rewritten right now. So there possibilities. There are all possibilities where previously they didn't exist fully. So they didn't exist fully. So we are now working on new timelines that were not previously available to us. So that's why, again, part of this huge shift, people coming into new alignments, people resonating on new frequencies. And he was specifically talking about a new archetype that was being entered into our consciousness, and that was the alien archetype, which makes complete sense.
Yes.
Yeah. And he also, interestingly enough, did a little brief meditation on that, which I will also post. It's part of the...
Far out.
Yeah, it's really cool.
Nice. Meditation with Bashar.
Yeah, and it's beautiful. It's a beautiful meditation because he uses this wonderful light screen and this beautiful like honeycomb shape. But the interesting part is that he's talking specifically about a vortex in Sedona. And I had
a lot about that.
I had just had a dream about a week ago. A little over a week ago, where I was in Sedona and I was a dragon and I was flying around this vortex, riding on this energy, and it was the most beautiful energy I'd ever felt. And there were all these other dragons there. And I was like, I have no idea what that means. Am I supposed to go to Sedona? Am I going to be a dragon from now on? You know, what's happening here? And so now I'm realizing
if you turn into a dragon, you're not allowed to do it in the house. Okay.
Oh, man. That's what my mom said too.
No dragon poop on the floor.
Exactly. You feed it and you clean up after it. But it's this really beautiful meditation where he takes us all to this vortex in Sedona that is, everybody's, we're pouring new energies into it. And so it, of course, will come back to us. So it's helping just create a level of shift for everyone that is kind of experiencing that new level of density right now, that new level of frequency.
It's interesting that you say that because I want to say a few months back, like 6 months back, I watched, is it Melchizedek?
Dranvalio?
Yes. Dranvalio.
Melchizedek.
And he did a meditation, which was to help people come and to be able to tap into that vortex in Sedona because it was in order to help support the transition of the energies that were coming in through that started really like back in February is what my understanding of it is, January, February. And it was very powerful.
Yeah, there are a couple of really big vortexes in Sedona. Some are both balanced, I guess, male, female. So they're really to balance your energy. Some are more female, some are more male. So just depending on what the needs are for the planet, I guess, it's really interesting to me because I just started doing all of this research on Sedona because I had never had any pull there ever until I had this really cool dream. And then I was like, wow, I really want to go to Sedona now. Right. And then realizing, okay, now I know why.
Yeah.
Yeah, the different vortexes, I've been there and meditated in all the more popular ones. There's also a lot of other ones that aren't so public.
I'm sure.
Yeah, but the more popular ones, like it's interesting because you can stand in there and meditate. And on some, I got like these electrical impulses in my palms. It would be swirling a certain way. And in a different one, I would get like a different kind of pressure in my head when I walk in there and meditate. And yeah.
We're all experiencing this right now. I wish you could see everybody kind of going, whoa, what is that energy?
Yeah, it was very powerful and it felt awesome. I just wanted to stay there, but I had a seminar to go to.
Don't bring those things up for the show, man.
Well, next time I'm a dragon, I will invite you all on my magic carpet.
Holy
and we can all go to Sedona and...
Can we ride you like Falcor?
Totally.
Please. I want to ride you, Hannah.
Exactly. Well, I'm working on growing 7 heads right now on my dragon. So there will be...
high dragon?
Yeah, exactly. My beastie. So we'll have multiple heads, so you can just pick which one you want to ride on. And
that sounds like a dream.
Dream, reality. We said all things are possible.
That's right. I want to go to that reality. Let's find that vibration.
I do that when I'm dreaming. So I've been doing a lot of that lately. I've been doing a lot of my work while I'm dreaming. I actually did some work with an alien this last week.
Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, no, I don't remember a whole lot of it. All I just remember is I woke up at one point and I was drooling and I was like, wow, this is intense. Go back to sleep. Okay.
Yeah, last night I just had the most intense dreams last night, and I could feel all these beings around me. And when I went to sleep last night, like I've been not sleeping with stones a lot lately, but last night I had my smoky quartz jersey that I usually wear like in my pillow, and in one hand I was holding a Tibetan quartz point, and in my other hand I was holding my smoky quartz point. And I went to sleep that way, I dropped into meditation, and that's usually how I go to sleep at night, isn't by meditating down into sleep. And I woke up the next morning and I felt like I had been surrounded by a crowd of beings, and I looked and I couldn't find my points anywhere. They were nowhere. And I looked and they were on my headboard facing towards me, on either side of my body. Like they were spaced out on my head. So like they just taken them out of my hands and put them, they're in the way. We're going to put them up here.
We're going to grid your bed a little bit.
That's what you needed to grid, not you. I'm like, yeah, but they fall on my head when I'm sleeping. So I don't put them up there, but it was interesting. It was like a good confirmation for me. Like, yeah, no, you weren't actually alone last night. I didn't tell my husband. That usually makes it hard for him to sleep, but he gets a little worried. Like, come on, they're just aliens in the bedroom. They're not doing anything.
They're here to help.
They're always there anyways.
I know, they really are. We had this discussion, actually. He was like, when I first started doing this work and realized,
especially you and us.
Yeah, Brandon came over and it was our first like real intense working, and I was like, I feel like we need to touch palms. And so we touched palms, and we could feel this like vortex open above the table. Brandon's feeling it again. Yeah. His head's all moving. And Pratik, my husband, he comes down and he's blind, so he listens to his books on a little Daisy player. It's like a little MP3 kind of like player. And he comes down and he's like, I hope I'm not disturbing you guys. And we're like, no, it's totally fine. And all of a sudden his MP3 player gets completely wiped. All of the memory of the book he was listening to, I think he was actually listening to a movie. Everything right on the whole thing got wiped off. All of his books, all of his movies, all of his everything, except for this one little snippet of an interview with this Indian yogi talking about Babaji.
Oh, that's right.
Brandon had talked to me about Baba G, and it just was repeating Baba G, and he was like, "Man, I hope you guys aren't going to mess up the house, are you?" Because he was worried all this other stuff would be lost because we just messed with his electronics in a very real way, you know.
Well, he stepped right into the field.
He did. It was his own fault.
We talked about certainty, right?
Blame the blind guy.
It's so easy to blame. We really don't discriminate. I married him. I love him, but yeah, oh God, it was like he just stumbled right into it. But after that, he was always asking me, Jesse, are you inviting things in? What's the permissive boundaries? Did you set up? I don't want him in the room when we're having time together. I'm like, I don't think they want to be there. I'm thinking it's all good.
Well,
I know.
Shush, Brandon. I'm telling you to shush right now. Sometimes he listens to these.
Right. You're all alone.
We're all alone. No observers.
guys, she's alone now.
Exactly. We'll clear the room after we're done.
Anyway, sorry. I know that was kind of off topic.
I kind of picture these little aliens looking at you like they watch the Discovery Channel.
Yeah, right.
Now we have to sing the song.
Yeah.
If Pratik were here, he would be singing the song.
Yes, he would.
With his own little twist. Well, that was pretty much our discussion on the multiverse and dimensionality. What?
I said, and then some.
And then some.
It's always then some. That's all right.
I know, we can't really help ourselves. So, yeah, again, we just wanted to thank all of you guys, our listeners. We wanted to thank Eric Klein for being our awesome producer.
Thank you, Eric.
Making us sound so good. And George Freeman for all of your support and your writing help. Thank you.
Thank you, George.
We love
Thank
what you
both.
post. And yeah, make sure that you, we'd love to hear what you think about or your experiences of the multiverse. You can write to us at thecrystalcocoon@gmail.com. You can look up our episodes if you want to listen ahead. You can go and find us at The Crystal Cocoon on YouTube or iTunes. You can find our page or our group discussion on Facebook under the same, and Google Plus and Lisbon and Tumblr. So we also haven't been tweeting much, but we're at the crystal_cocoon_ on Twitter. Let us know if you want us to tweet, because we really aren't much big tweeters here.
Yeah.
So unless you tell us to.
I think I tweeted last week.
Oh, you did?
I did.
Would that be like our second tweet?
Yeah, I'm pretty sure I tweeted last. Just the one.
Thank you.
I did.
So thank you very much for returning to us, and we'll see you guys next week.
Thank
All
you.
right.